From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
At age 4, Maria Venegas emigrated from her home in Mexico to the United States. She grew up in Chicago, where she attended the University of Illinois, and then moved to New York to pursue her writing. Her debut memoir, Bulletproof Vest, The Ballad of an Outlaw and His Daughter, portrays a deep narrative of her difficult relationship with her father. When she was younger, her father one day left in a bulletproof vest and never returned to his family. After learning of his legacy of brutal violence and revenge, the two were estranged for more than 14 years. Venegas returned to Mexico to reconnect with her father, and he shared stories from his dramatic life filled with a harsh culture of violence and retribution. In Bulletproof Vest, Venegas struggles to come to terms with her father's actions, but learns the complexity of the situation that shaped his life, and with it, her own. If you'd like to get the book autographed, she will be signing books at the book signing area at 3 p.m. Please join me in welcoming Maria Venegas.
Hi. First of all, I just wanted, am I being really loud? Can everybody hear me? I can tell. I just wanted to thank the National Book Festival for inviting me to participate. I feel really honored to be here. And there was actually a gala last night at the Library of Congress. And it's kind of amazing to me to think that Thomas Jefferson at some point had over 6,000 books in his personal library, because when I was growing up, we had one book in our house, and it was the Bible. And it's when I was growing up, I never thought about being an author. I didn't read much growing up, but I thought I was going to grow up to be a famous fashion designer. And when I went away to college, I studied economics because I felt that if I had it was international economics, and I thought if I had a solid understanding on the world economy and how it worked, it would help with my business, since I would be importing fabric from one country and exporting my designs to another. And then my final semester at the University of Illinois, I took an acting class because I had already finished all of my requirements for my major. And so I took this acting class thinking it would be an easy A. And it actually turned out not to quite be an easy A. I ended up with a B in the class. But I fell in love with acting. I felt like I had found my thing, and that's what I was going to do. And so after I graduated, I moved to Chicago and continued to pursue acting. And so in doing so, I took more classes and started going out on auditions. And what I found, unfortunately, was that a lot of the roles that were available to Latina actresses at that particular moment in time, I think it's changed a bit now, but they were very stereotypical roles. And so a lot of the auditions I was getting called in for were for, I think the three main ones were the drug dealer's girlfriend, the maid, and the prostitute. And it was really upsetting, and I kept running into other Latina actresses at the same auditions, and we ended up forming our own theater troupe and started writing our own vignettes for the stage. And they were much more complex than these stereotypical roles that we were being sent out for. But I also think, because I think last night somebody else was also speaking to diversity in literature, and I think that there is a moment in time where I felt like at that point we could have continued to perpetuate these stereotypes, or the alternative was to start telling our own stories. And so that's really sort of where I started writing. Initially, it was for the theater, we ended up, my theater troupe, we put together a full-length show and sent it to a theater in New York City, Intar, and they wanted to workshop our play. So I went to New York for that summer to workshop the play, and that was back in 2001, and I never left. So I feel like it turned into an endless summer. I'm still there. And so while I was in New York, even though I actually did end up working a corporate job in fashion because I had to pay the bills. So I was doing that, and I was still taking acting classes in the evenings and writing classes, and then eventually I was just taking writing classes and really loving it. And then one of my instructors read a short story that I'd written, and she suggested I apply to an MFA program. And I did. I applied to 3 and got into all 3, and the rest is history, I guess, as they say. So the book, Bulletproof Vest, I feel like my father, you know, he left, he shot and killed our neighbor when I was a kid, and I know it sounds kind of crazy. It's sort of that idea of, there's that old saying, write what scares you. And my father was my best kept secret for so many years. I never talked about him or the past or any of it, because it really sort of all terrified me, I guess, in a way. But he and it sounds crazy to say, my father killed our neighbor. You know, it sounds like something made up. But he, you know, it was self-defense, and it was proven to be self-defense, but because he used an unregistered weapon, he still had to go to court. But then what ended up happening is that he shot and killed the man, and this man had 2 brothers. And so then there were rumors around our suburb of Chicago that the 2 brothers were asking questions around town, you know, like, well, where does Jose live, and how many kids does he have, and how many sons, and how many daughters? And so my father ended up buying himself a bulletproof vest and carried on living his life the way he always had. And then a few months later, he ended up packing up his truck, and he left for Mexico and never came back. So then we were kind of left in this situation where there are these 2 brothers that potentially are seeking retribution or revenge, and we would call 911. We used to call the police all the time, my brothers and sisters and I, because we were so scared that, you know, if we just heard a small noise on the front porch or at the back door, we were calling 911, to the point where they just, you know, a police officer, he actually finally suggested that we move. And they knew us, and actually my sister ran into one of the officers from that suburb, you know, many, many years later. And he was like, oh, you're one of those Venegas kids, and he remembered us, you know? And he said, you know, we used to talk about you kids at the station. We worried about what would become of you, which I thought was really sweet. But then, of course, my sister and I were joking, and we were like, yeah, they were probably worried that once we grew up, we might keep them busy for years to come. That's possibly what they were worried about. But anyway, so my father left, and then 14 years went by, and we had no communication with him. I didn't really have a relationship with him for 14 years, but news of his whereabouts always seemed to reach us. So we kind of were always aware that he was back in Mexico, and then at some point he was in Colorado. He was extradited for murder for a man he had killed in Mexico from Colorado, and then he was back in Mexico in prison. And then he spent 4 years in prison, and then his parents bailed him out. They sold a really beautiful home that they had in the plaza in town to bail him out. And actually, I think I'm going to read from a little bit of one of my favorite chapters in the book, and it's called Shooting Guns Like Shooting Stars. And it kind of, you know, because a lot of the stories in the book came to me through my father, because when I went back to visit him in Mexico, he was living on the old hacienda on the ranch where both he and I had been born. And after that initial visit, I went back and spent holidays and summers with him, and he started sharing stories. I think one of those first visits, I actually made the mistake of bringing a tape recorder, like an idiot, on set, and tried interviewing him. And it was really awkward because I think he didn't really trust me and I didn't really trust him. And so to be like, so did you or did you not kill that man? You know, lean in and speak into the microphone. You know, it's like, not having it. And so finally I realized that the best stories were the ones that I wouldn't have ever thought to ask him about. We would, he'd settle up the horses and we'd ride out to his ranch at 4 a.m. And he'd be like, he'd see a tree and be like, oh, it was near that tree that Antonio and I ran into Fidel and they pulled out their guns and shot at each other. Or just certain things sparked stories of his past and his upbringing. And so I started to write the book because I started to write these stories that he was sharing with me. And he very much kind of became my muse. And I think also in writing about him, it was a way for me to try and make sense of him and make sense of why he had lived such a violent and self-destructive life. Because when I was a kid, I just always felt like why did we have to end up with a father for this lunatic for a father? You know, nobody else, nobody in my father used to go to to that saying of you can take the cowboy out of but you can't take the cowboy out of the man, or whatever the saying, however it goes. But he was born and raised in the mountain town in Mexico, and then when we were living in the Chicago suburbs, he'd go out to the taverns and come home and unload, before turning in for the night, he would go outside and unload his gun in our front lawn. Like, send 4 or 5 bullets into the front lawn or into the sky and then go to bed. So the neighbors used to call the police and report gunshots. And then eventually they just got used to it. It's like eventually I think they heard gunshots and it was just like, oh, Jose's going to bed. And they didn't bother calling the police anymore. But of course, being his kid, I was always like, why? It was kind of a nightmare, because I was like, why does he have to be so crazy? I didn't understand what made him tick. And I didn't know where we had come from back in Mexico. So anyways, I think in writing this book and these stories, it was kind of my trying to understand how he was wired. But I'm going to read a little bit from Shooting Guns Like Shooting Stars. And I think, all you need to know, it's set in Mexico, in La Peña, which is the place where my father was living, and also it takes place, it's on New Year's Eve. Scattered stars began to appear, one by one, like eyes glistening against the cobalt sky. The sliver of moon doesn't illuminate enough of the darkness. Out there beyond the courtyard, on the dirt road where the dogs have fused into a ball of claws and teeth tearing through the night. Out there where dust is already clinging to fresh blood. One dog breaks from the pack and runs towards the church that sits under the single light post in La Peña. A cloud of dust rises toward the light as the pack pounces on the one that broke from them, the one that tried to get away. A log collapses in the fire, red sparks soar into the cool air, mingle with the growling, and then vanish. Should we do something? I ask my father. About what? He asks, leaning back in his white plastic chair, his legs extended in front of him and crossed, one over the other, so that the soles of his cowboy boots are almost in the fire. The dogs, I say. Won't they kill each other? Nah, they'll work it out, he says, taking a swig from the rum and coke in his nicked tin cup. The battle continues to rage in front of the small church, while in the distance, along the dark ridge, lights from other ranches are coming into focus. Out there, where a pair of eyes could be watching the glow of the fire dance across our faces. Normally, we don't stay outside past dark. Once the chickens have tucked themselves into the branches of the eucalyptus tree and the sun has gone down, we go inside, lock the doors, and stay put until morning. I hook my index finger to the rubber band holding my ponytail in place and slide it off, let my hair fall freely around my shoulders. Why are they fighting like that? I ask. My father is now down on one knee, rearranging the logs in the fire. Maybe it's a sign, I say. Yeah, maybe, he says. Maybe La Huesona's on the loose, desperate to take a few more souls before the year ends. He rolls a thick log into the fire. Only a few hours left, he grunts, as he centers it in the burning pile. This log should last us all night, or at least until the new year, he says, taking his seat. Encino, great wood. I chopped it myself. It doesn't burn down as fast as the others. He glances at me and follows my gaze out to the rumbling that is now moving around the back of the house. I think one of those dogs is in heat, he says. That's why they're all worked up. I lean back into my chair and take a sip from the rum and coke. The dry heat from the fire feels good on my bare arms. You see those 3 stars? He asks, pointing at the Big Dipper. I look past the clothesline and the electrical wires that hang above. When we were kids, he says, we used to call those Los Reyes Magos. Oh, over there, I say. They call those the word eludes me. It's like this sometimes. I can't find the right word in Spanish and hesitate. It's like the small pot or pan, I say, or like the big spoon. You see how the 3 stars are in a row, how they seem to form a handle? Uh-huh, he says. And though his face is still turned toward the sky, he's giving me a sideways glance, a one-eyed squint. The sky is filled with stars, thousands of them, sitting around the moon, waiting for the new year to arrive. A small piece of raw meat clings to the clothesline above. A few days ago, a cow broke an ankle and had to be put down. My father had salted the meat that didn't fit in the freezer and hung it on the clothesline to be dried by the sun. Raw meat hung like laundry in the courtyard for 2 days. He reaches up, plucks the piece off the clothesline and throws it into the fire. I made that rope when I was in prison, he says, pointing at the clothesline. It's a yellow rope that's tied to an extension cord that is then tied to the water well post. That one and the pink one I tied to your saddle this morning, he says. They teach you how to make rope in jail? I ask. They teach you how to do lots of things, he says. If you pay attention, you come out knowing more than when you went in. I gave those ropes to my father when he came to visit me to tell me they had sold the house in the plaza and deposited the money in an account for the lawyer that was working on my case. The dogs have worked their way around the corral and are now barreling down the dirt road towards us, the snarling louder and louder as they approach. Maybe we should go inside, I say. Nah, if we go inside, we'll fall asleep, he says. Perhaps thinking back to last year when I had picked up a bottle of red wine and made us a filet mignon and mashed potato dinner, and by the time midnight arrived, we were both passed out. It's nicer here by the fire. We can have a few drinks, a bit of a plática, and after the new year arrives, we'll go inside and iron our ears out. He looks at my bare arms, my ripped jeans. You want to borrow a jacket? No, I'm fine, I say, taking a gulp from my cup. Do you really want to go inside? He asks. Well, maybe, I say. Well, then, we should put out the fire, he says. We sit in silence for a while. I stare out past the dirt road, past the house where both he and I were born, and can't help but feel like we are being watched. I sit up and face him. What if someone shoots us? I ask. His whole body turns towards me. No, mijita, he shakes his head. ¿Qué pasó? Don't think like that. He reaches into the fire, grabs one of the logs and flips it. No one's gonna come bother us here, not at this hour. Not just any pendejo would come near here, he says. Besides, it's the holidays. Everyone is too busy celebrating. Everyone is busy celebrating and drinking and celebrating all day long. Men have been knocking them back at the rodeos, the cockfights, the horse races, the sun beating on their eyelids, visions blurring, old conflicts rising to the surface. It's during the holidays that tragedy seemed to happen around these parts. It was on Christmas Eve 22 years ago that my brother was shot, fell face down in the river, and drowned. My father is back on one knee, adjusting the logs in the fire. I polish off my drink and stand up. Is there any more left? He asks, grinning at me, a glint of the fire in his eyes. Yeah, I say, taking his cup. I'll go make us 2 more. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So I think it's strange because I'm talking and there's a weird echo coming back to me, so it's really odd. But I wanted to read this particular section from this chapter because it was just for me a really kind of lovely moment to have had that New Year's with my father. But then also, this is kind of how a lot of the stories that are in the book came to me. It was through him, through us just sort of sitting in front of a fire and like with the rope, and he said, I made that rope in prison and I gave it to my father and when they sold the house in the plaza. And so that's kind of how the stories came to me. And it was interesting when I started to write Bulletproof Vest, I knew I didn't want to write a straight first-person narrative. And it also didn't make sense that it should all be in first person because so many of the stories were so much my father that I kind of played around with point of view. And finally, I think it's the first chapter in the book, the ambush scene. At one point, my father was driving home from the town back to his ranch, and he was ambushed. There were 2 men with machine guns were waiting in the ditches, and they shot up his truck. So he had told me this story, and I wrote that story in first person so that the reader was getting the story as it had come to me through the dialogue. But it really felt flat, and it also really felt like it killed the urgency of the scene at hand. And so then I went back and rewrote it in third person. And then that's when it really clicked. And that was actually kind of an exciting moment for me because when I wrote it in third person, so the story was being filtered through my father's point of view. And so it enabled me to get out of the way of the story and just let kind of the story come to the reader as it had come to me. And I was able to put the reader in the truck with my father so that they also were seeing the bugs hit the windshield and listening to whatever corrido was blasting from his truck. But that was an exciting moment when I discovered that it worked. And so the structure of the book now is kind of, it switches between third person and first person and between my father's point of view and my point of view. And I think maybe, towards the end, my father, he was an outlaw, and I certainly would never justify or try to justify anything that he did, but I think in his own mind, he had found a way to justify his own actions. But it's ironic because then the drug cartels, the prison that my father was at, he should have been there for life for murder, but he was bailed out 4 years later. And then many years later, that same prison, I don't know if you might have read it was in the New York Times, but the 53 inmates escaped from that same prison. This was, I think, May of 2011, I want to say. But 53 inmates escaped from the prison within 5 minutes, and not a single shot was fired. And pretty soon after that jailbreak, people in the town where my father was living started disappearing and being kidnapped. And the kidnappings, that's something that had already been occurring in other parts of Mexico for like the 2 years maybe. But it hadn't made its way to Zacatecas. But right after that jailbreak, it seemed like the convoy from that prison break, they probably drove straight to his town. And I was actually there, and the last time I went to visit my father, there were stories surfacing of people being kidnapped, and I do think it's kind of ironic. Well, I'm not going to give it away, actually. I'm going to, I think, I'm going to read from one of a chapter called The Kidnapping. That's towards the end of the book. And yeah, and I like this chapter because it kind of exemplifies the shift between third person and first person. And so I think I'm just going to read this. It's a small section. And then, yeah, okay. They have been watching him, keeping tabs on his moves, keeping tabs on the road that runs in front of his house. And earlier that day, they saw him and Rosario climb into his red truck and drive clear out of town. When he returns in the afternoon, he pulls into the dusty lot where the mercado is held on Sundays. Rosario waits in the passenger seat while he goes into a cell phone store. He's in the store for a mere 10 minutes, but by the time he steps back out into the slanted rays of the afternoon sun, everything has shifted. Blinds have been drawn in nearby stores, the sidewalks have emptied, doors have been locked, and most of the cars that were parked near his truck vacated the scene when the black SUVs rolled up. He makes his way across the lot, scrolling through his phone, when the sound of the gravel crunching under his boots stops him in his tracks. It's not the rhythm of the gravel that is off, but rather the absence of familiar sounds. Missing is the laughter, the shrieking and yelling of kids playing a makeshift soccer game in the lot. Gone is the rustling of bags, of people rushing along, running afternoon errands. Even the incessant bell of the paletero has been silenced. Nothing but the echo of a dog barking in the distance fills the space around him. He looks up and notices the SUVs stationed on either side of his vehicle. Though it's the sight of the man sitting next to Rosario and grinning at him from behind the steering wheel of his red truck that sends the gold caps vibrating against his teeth so that he can practically taste the metal. He's standing still but hears the gravel shifting, footsteps approaching from behind, as if his own shadow had sprung to life. Vamos, viejo. There are two men with machine guns standing on either side of him. They escort him into the back seat of one of the SUVs, where a woman is waiting for him. Hola, mi gallinita de oro, she says, her chapped lips parting into a grin and revealing her rust-colored teeth. The sour stench of alcohol exudes from her. He recognizes the rifle she's holding between her knees. It's the same rifle that has hung above his bed for years, the same rifle with which he had blown the head off of a rattlesnake when he was 10 years old. The woman snatches his cell phone from his hand and searches his pockets, pulling out his red handkerchief and his worn leather wallet. A man climbs into the seat on the other side of him and the convoy starts moving. The SUV he's riding in follows his truck onto the main road, and by the time they clear the last speed bump on the edge of town, they have already removed his boots and tied his ankles and wrists together. Who's Norma Venegas? The woman asks as she scrolls through his phone. She's a niece, he says. She's not your daughter. No, she's a niece. They fly past the slaughterhouse where two other SUVs are sitting in the shade under the mezquite. A niece, she narrows her eyes on him. She's not a bad-looking woman, early 40s most likely. Those scars across her cheekbone, dark circles under her eyes, and her rotting teeth seem to age her beyond her years. What's the name of your daughter, the one who owns the gas station in Jalisco? I don't have any daughters in Jalisco. She rams the butt of the rifle into his kneecaps with so much force that it sends a shock through his injured hip. Don't play smart with me, viejo. She tells him they are well aware of his 5 daughters, and word around town is that one of them lives in Jalisco and owns a gas station, so what is her number? I don't know where you're getting your information from, he says, though perhaps they've gotten it from him, because even though businesses have started closing early and everyone goes home before dark, locks their doors, and stays put until morning, the taverns are still open. And though they have lost a few regulars, he carries on as he always has. He's not one to hide from the SUVs or anyone for that matter, especially not in his own town. He has continued frequenting the taverns, and after having a few drinks, it's inevitable. He will start boasting about his 5 girls and how successful they are, how each one has made a small fortune, and with no help from a man at that. I don't have any daughters in Jalisco, he says. What about your daughter who lives in Nueva York? What is her number? Again, she's scrolling through his phone. I don't have any daughters living in Nueva York. Who's the girl who was just visiting you? She's just a niece, he says, bracing himself to keep the weight of his body from barreling into the woman as they fly around the only curve on the road between town and his home. Another niece, the woman smirks at him before ramming the butt of the rifle into his other kneecap. What is her name? Maria de Jesus, he says, and again she's scrolling through his phone, though he knows she will never find that name, or any of their names for that matter. He has all 5 numbers saved under their nicknames: Chuyita, La Flaca, Chela, La Vicky, Sonita. Up ahead, his truck slows and turns left onto the dirt road that leads up to La Peña. Even before they pull up in front of his house, he notices that the minivan he picked up 2 weeks before is gone, and that his house has been broken into. His bedroom door is scraped, bent, and slightly ajar. 2 men help Rosario out of the truck. The woman gets out of the SUV, lights a cigarette, and walks a full circle around Rosario before stopping in front of her and asking what is the name of the viejo's daughter, the one who owns a gas station in Jalisco. I don't really know anything about his daughters, Rosario says. The woman takes a long drag, narrowing her gaze on Rosario before slapping her clear across the face. Call his daughters, she says. Tell them we have their father, and if they ever want to see him again, they can reach us at this number. She scribbles the digits down on a scrap of paper and hands it to Rosario. The convoy starts moving, and once again, the SUV he's riding in is following his truck. The woman reaches into the seat pocket in front of her and pulls out a roll of toilet paper and duct tape. She takes 2 wads of toilet paper, presses them to his eyes, and while she holds them there, one of the men wraps the duct tape tightly around his head. Inside that new darkness, a different light snaps on. The lay of that land is practically a part of his genetic makeup, etched in his bones. And now there's a space, and now it switches to me. It's Monday night, and I'm having dinner with a friend in my neighborhood. I'm running to the bathroom, my friend says, pushing her chair away from the table. The waiter comes by and drops off our check. I reach for my bag and notice my cell is vibrating. I have 2 missed calls from Sonia and a text from her. Call me, 911. This can't be good, I think. As I stare at the flame in the votive, watch how it sways each time someone opens the door. What happened now? What if he's dead? What if he killed someone? The reflection of the flame makes the smooth grooves in the wooden table look dark and warm, and there's a part of me that wants to crawl into one of those small nooks and stay there for a very long time. What's the damage? My friend asks when she returns. There's a bounce in her platinum blonde hair, and she's wearing a fresh coat of pink lipstick. I just got a text from my sister, I say, clearing my throat, and she wants me to call her 911. Well, that can't be good, she says. I know. I tap my phone twice on the table. The bartender pours wine for a couple sitting at the bar, and the polished glass bottles are gleaming on the wall behind him. Well, you should probably call her back, my friend says. Right. I reach for my glass of red wine and down what's left before calling Sonia. When she picks up, she informs me that she just got off the phone with Mary, who received a call from Rosario saying that my father has been kidnapped. Kidnapped, I say. How? By who? She doesn't know all the details, but according to Rosario, they had ransacked the whole house. The wardrobes, the storage trunks had all been rifled, and they had left shattered dishes, pillows, and clothing strewn in their wake. They had given Rosario a number where they could be reached. And, I say, did Mary call them? She thinks we should stay out of it, Sonia says. When Rosario had called Mary and told her what happened, Mary had taken a few moments to let the news sink in before responding with a single knee-jerk reaction. You know what, Rosario? for all I know, he did something to provoke this, and I'm not getting involved, she said. You can call them and tell them that they're not going to get a penny out of me or any of his kids because he abandoned us when we were young. Mary had refused to even take down the number. Well, how much money are they asking for? I ask, aware of how my friend is staring at me from across the table. She's British, a fashion designer, and probably can't comprehend the words coming out of my mouth. They want like 500,000 pesos or dollars or something like that. She's not certain of the amount, as Mary wouldn't even hear of it. My friend and I settle the tab and go home. I spend the next hour pacing around my apartment and feeling utterly useless. The first thing we do is erase our voices. We all change our greeting so that if anyone calls, they hear the automated response repeating the number they just dialed back to them. If the kidnappers call, they can't be certain of who they've reached. And if they can't get a hold of us, they can't threaten us. Rosario calls that evening and leaves several messages, pleading me to call her back. And though she sounds genuinely upset, I don't return her call. There are too many unknowns. What if we send the money and they ask for more money? What if we send the money and then they go after our mother? What if we send the money and they kill him anyway? What if Rosario is in cahoots with the kidnappers? Why had they left her as the middleman? Or worse, what if he had something to do with it? What if somehow he provoked this, messed with the wrong herd, or owed someone money? Later that night, I lie in bed, tossing and turning, and wondering where he may be at that very moment, imagining they probably have him blindfolded and tied to a wooden chair somewhere in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, and that they must be taunting him. Kidnapped. That word tumbles endlessly in my thoughts as the fan whirs in the window, providing little relief from the oppressive August humidity. What a strange word. What a vast gray space. What a relief. Dead is an infinite black hole from which nothing is retrievable. Kidnapped is good. There is hope. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think that 2 minutes for before questions. Oh, okay. To questions. Okay. If you want, I think we can go to questions. Yeah. Yeah. Is that okay? Questions? Yeah? Okay, so I think I'm done talking and reading. Sorry. So if anybody has any questions, concerns, complaints, now is when. Yes? What about your mother? One of my friends told me she was going to make me a T-shirt that said, "What about your mother?" I think as I said previously, this book really, it started off as, I really wanted to write my father's life story, and I started to write, it was all these short stories that he had shared with me. So I really wanted the focus to remain on that. And as it is, I didn't so much want to write a memoir. But I feel like I even got pulled into the book, of course, because my editor was like, he said, an American reader isn't going to relate to your father, but they're going to relate to you being the daughter of this man, and you need to be in the book more. And so, but my mother, she has a very complex life story, and I think that might be a book yet to be written. So it's coming. Okay. I'm just getting flashed that we're over time, so I think that might be, there's one person waiting. Can I just take one more question? Okay, one more question and that's it.
I was just wondering, when you were growing up, before you went back to Mexico, how much did you know about your father's history at that time?
Not much. I mean, I kind of knew, what I knew was what I had picked up listening to my mother and her sisters sort of while they were making tamales around the holidays. It's talking about things that happened in Mexico, and actually Mexico, for many years to me, Mexico seemed like this really scary place, and it seemed like anybody that went back to Mexico never came back, like the land itself swallowed them up or something. So I didn't know a whole lot about what he had done in his background until I went back there and reconnected with him. And I'm so glad that I did, and that I got the opportunity to do that before he died. So, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and sitting through this.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.